My name is Thomas Gaehtgens, and I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute. You can imagine what problem we had in the last days here, and there were many conversations if we would come together today at this place. But I'm very happy that the hard core of this group of specialists could make it. And so I want only to welcome you very warmly for this meeting. But I also want to say that our hearts go out to all affected by the fire. We especially commend the heroic work of the firefighters who have been working around the clock to contain the fire around the Getty. It was really on the other side, and if you came up, you have probably seen where the fire was. And it was dangerous, and it was even terrible for all those who lost their houses in this area, and the story is still going on at other places in Northern California. Well, let's come to our topic here. This event is organized in conjunction with the two very special Pacific Standard Time LALA exhibitions that showcase magnificent examples of work by indigenous artists and authors, Golden Kingdom, Luxury and Legacy in the Ancient Americas at the Getty Center. And that was also, of course, a reason why I would like to have the conference here, and you have the chance to see the exhibition. And Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin, which is also a great exhibition at the Huntington Library, Art Collections and Botanical Gardens. These two shows stand out from the other wonderful PST shows because one focuses on the pre-Columbian period, the other on the early modern period. Whereas the others, largely, many others, up to 70, represent modern and contemporary art. For the Getty Research Institute, it has been important to not only reflect the art of modern and contemporary Latin American art and Latino artists, but also support the investigation of art around the world from a more distant past. And that is a mission shared by the Early Modern Studies Institute. Additionally, these shows and this event celebrate the great accomplishments, ingenuity and diversity of indigenous art and artists in the Americas. I would like to thank the EMSI, our organizing partner, and the organizing team for persevering in the light of these difficult circumstances and for working hard to keep the conference going. Over the past few days, until yesterday afternoon, they worked hard and day and night to devise Plan B, which would have involved moving the event to USC. But we were glad that we were able to keep the symposium at the Getty because it allows you to go up and see several times Golden Kingdom this afternoon. One of the team's motivating factor to keep going was that we had such an enthusiastic response. The event very quickly sold out with 800 positive responses, and they did not want to let the audience, we didn't want to let the audience down. Of the many people involved, I would like to thank the core team, Daniela Bleichmar, Associate Professor at USC, and Kim Richter, Senior Research Specialist at the GRI, who conceived and organized the event, well as Amy Braden, Associate Director of the EMSI, and especially Chelsea. You did really a wonderful job, I have to say that, under these very difficult conditions. Programming Associate at the GRI, who were in charge for all the logistical components for the event. And let me also stress again the wonderful cooperation with USC, who were really so helpful and open to relocate the whole symposium to USC. But we are still happy. I mean, we like USC, but we want to have it close to our exhibition, of course. I'm also very grateful to our other event sponsor, the Seaver Institute, which is not only supporting this event, but also a major research and publication project about the Florentine Codex, and most of you know about that. One of the main repositories of indigenous knowledge. And of course, there it is. And of course, I want to welcome the speakers for sharing their knowledge with us today. And now please join me in welcoming Daniela Bleichmar and Kim Richter.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, bienvenidos, shimo panolti, and I don't know if I'm butchering this because I don't speak Quechua, but hai kui kui. We are so thrilled to welcome you to our symposium, which we organize in conjunction with our respective exhibitions, Golden Kingdoms and Visual Voyages, and as the EMSI's the annual conference. And we, of course, echo all the sentiments about the fires and the circumstances in which we're finding ourselves today.
And in connection to that, Peter Mankal, the director of the Early Modern Studies Institute, is not able to be here to participate in the opening remarks because his house was evacuated and he's assessing smoke damage, but he will be here later today and join us for the rest of the conference.
With this symposium, we hope to probe different types of indigenous knowledge during the early modern period and to address how indigenous knowledge contributed to the making of colonial Latin American society. In our shows, this indigenous knowledge is represented by the artworks and especially by manuscripts written and painted by indigenous authors and artists, sometimes in collaboration with Spaniards. While our shows share various themes, we've talked about materiality and techne and other types of themes that we share. It is these manuscripts that really provide the bridge across the historical divide marked by the Spanish conquest. The Codex Mendoza, which we see here, represents one such bridge conveying pre-Columbian indigenous knowledge and illustrating its fundamental place in colonial society. And the Florentine Codex, which Thomas mentioned, represents another. And Daniela and I, as we were organizing these exhibitions and now that we have them here, we kept sort of like being like, are they really both here in our shows? Because they have one volume of the Florentine Codex and we have another. So you can go and see one later and then hopefully you'll make it to Visual Voyages as well to see it there. So these, of course, are invaluable to our knowledge of these colonial periods. These containers of knowledge prompted us to organize this event. We invited speakers whose research focuses on different regions and different indigenous cultures in Latin America, and also on various types of indigenous knowledge, such as artistic knowledge ranging from manuscript painting to gold working, medicinal knowledge, historical knowledge, elite versus non-elite knowledge, public versus domestic knowledge, etc. Our speakers are also coming from different disciplines ranging from art history, literary studies, history of science, archaeology, conservation, and material science, because we are interested in how knowledge is construed and how these disciplines inform each other.
Our presenters will explore how indigenous knowledge during the colonial period was preserved, documented, valued, censored, eradicated, disseminated, and transformed, and analyze what this indigenous knowledge meant to colonial society and modern scholarship. And when we're putting together this program, one of the things we were hoping was that this conference would involve a lot of conversation. You will see that we have built into the program a lot of time for discussion, for questions and answers, because we wanted to think together as a group at multiple levels. One which we can call the empirical level, about the information that is recorded in the historical record, in the material record, and that our presenters will be discussing. But we also wanted very much to engage with methodological, theoretical, and historiographical issues. The question of indigenous knowledge is, of course, one that has long occupied scholars. We are not doing something new. We are building on work that has been carried out for many, many years. But we do think that this is a particular moment for this conference, that the questions and the materials that we will be examining are occupying a different place in the production of contemporary humanistic knowledge today. The global turn has really brought into question the centrality of areas that were considered central and the marginality of areas that were previously considered peripheral. And as part of that, it has also engaged questions of what is knowledge? Where does it reside? Who owns it? How do we understand its changing nature? Questions of epistemology, questions of ontology. How do we do the work that we do? What are the questions that we ask? What are questions we can answer? All of that seems to be shifting in extremely interesting ways. And so we're really hoping to have a conversation that addresses all these levels that we think can come up here. Thanks have already been given, and it is, customary and good manners to begin a conference by thanking the people who help you put it together. But I have never felt this more earnestly than this morning, because the last 2 days were insane. And I felt that I spent 36 straight hours on a 4-way call with Kim, Amy, and Chelsea. First of all, moving an entire conference from the Getty to USC and holding that in place until noon yesterday when we heard that today the Getty would be open, and then we moved it entirely back. And all of this is invisible work. Thank you. But really the superheroes are Amy and Chelsea, and I am so grateful, so blown away, and it's just so amazing to be working with professionals who are just so good at what they do. So, as I said yesterday, they deserve a medal and a bonus, neither of which I can grant, but the sentiment is there. In addition to Amy and Chelsea, and of course to my wonderful co-organizer, many other people have allowed this to happen. We also want to thank Adrian Casares at Getty Trust Events, Emily Anderson, Alicia Houtro, Lauren Johnson, Susan Colangelo, Rebecca Peabody, and Annie Coombs-Brooks at the EMSI and the GRI, our AV and visitor services staff at the Getty. We are grateful to our own institutions and our partner institutions for supporting this event. The Getty Research Institute, the Early Modern Studies Institute, the Visual Studies Research Institute, the Huntington, and the Seaver Institute. And we're also very grateful to you all for your interest. We thought this was an important topic. We thought it would attract both a scholarly and a public audience, and we are really delighted that you're here. So, without further ado...
That you weren't scared away by the fires.
Yes. Thank you so much, and we will move on to the first panel.
Yes. So Jeanette Peterson, who was going to be the first moderator of the first session, unfortunately also couldn't be here because she lives in San Diego and her house is near one of the new fires that broke out yesterday. So of course we wish her and her neighbors the best of luck and hope they come out of this unscathed. So she sends her greetings and wishes she could be here, but for obvious reasons she isn't. So I will be taking her place, and it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker, Amber Bryan, who's associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Iowa, where she also serves as the director of Latin American Studies program. Her PhD is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and in 2016 she published Alva Ixtlilxóchitl, Native Archive and Circulation of Knowledge in Colonial Mexico. This book was recently awarded an honorable mention for the Modern Language Association's Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize for Outstanding Book in the field of Latin American and Spanish literature and cultures. She's currently completing a long-term collaborative translation project of Alva Ixtlilxóchitl's Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, which has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, with Bradley Benton, Pablo Garcia Loaiza, and Peter Vieira. In 2015, she, Benton, Garcia Loaiza, published Native Conquistador Alva Ixtlilxóchitl's account of the conquest of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Kim, for the introductory comments, and thank you. I know we will all echo this gratitude today to our organizers and particularly who have been working overtime over the last 36 hours to make the Plan A happen here at the Getty. Here we are at this very extraordinary gathering, which I am quite honored and feel very fortunate to be part of. I'll start today with, and I feel that I should clarify that I very much am focused on the early modern period, though I will be starting with Prescott. I will not stick to the 19th century, but there's a relevance, and I hope you'll bear with me as I begin. Published in 1843, William H. Prescott's 1,000-page tome, History of the Conquest of Mexico, represents in romantic and epic fashion Hernando Cortez's defeat of the Aztecs. It is an important text for what it represents for 19th century historiography and for its tremendous influence, which reaches, one could argue, up to the present day. In his introductory essay to the 2001 edition, James Lockhart notes that if we look at the extent of Prescott's research, we are likely to be stunned. The voluminous corpus of larger formal writings of the 16th century in Spanish on the conquest of Mexico and its indigenous background was virtually all in Prescott's hands, even though at that time hardly any of it was published. Prescott's history synthesizes these sources and creates a coherent narrative from them. But there are also clues about the indigenous knowledge that is retained within the text. Prescott relies heavily on the historical works of one of the authors I'll discuss today, Don Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxóchitl, particularly in the first book of the Conquest of Mexico, which deals with Aztec civilization. At the very end of the last chapter of that book, Prescott offers an extended commentary on his use of Alva Ixtlilxóchitl's writings. And here he says, the 17th century historian has introduced us to the knowledge of the most polished people of Anahuac, whose records, if preserved, could not, at a much later period, have been comprehended. And he has thus offered a standard of comparison which much raises our ideas of American civilization. Prescott goes on in a laudatory vein and concludes by saying that Alva Ixtlilxóchitl is entitled to the name of the Levi of Anahuac. There are 3 points to underline in this passage. First, Indigenous knowledge from colonial Mexico traveled through space and time and eventually became registered in the work of a 19th century US historian. Second, Prescott viewed Albaicízotl as a mediator who was able to translate that knowledge into a language that would be more broadly comprehensible. And third, the praise of Albaicízotl notwithstanding, there is a notable tone of condescension and bias toward Native peoples, their experience, and their stories, which demonstrates a double gesture of appropriation and critique. These observations could be more widely applicable. Native knowledge traveled. As it traveled, it was translated. And scholars have, through time, appropriated and critiqued indigenous forms of knowing. But I should emphasize, indigenous knowledge is incorporated into Prescott's conquest of Mexico, even though Prescott himself was totally removed from the indigenous lived experience. To give our full attention, as we are today, to the question of indigenous knowledge in colonial Latin America, we are forced to think critically about those two terms. How is the indigenous or native defined? And how is knowledge defined, accessed, and represented? What forms are used to convey it and keep it? What are the pragmatic contexts in which it is constructed and utilized? What happens when knowledge passes from one cultural, political, or social context to another? This extraordinary symposium here at the Getty, and thank goodness we are here at the Getty, gives us a chance to address some of these questions and many others through the study of a wide range of material forms and cultural contexts. My small contribution is to draw our attention to the language of alphabetic texts that are the product of a Hispano-Indigenous intellectual context, where the authors exhibit a dual engagement with both Hispano-Catholic and Indigenous discourses and sources. My specific interest is in those places in the text where we witness tensions between these two intellectual currents. Native knowledge becomes a source of authority in the conquest histories I'll discuss today. As original native sources, oral, pictorial, alphabetic, are documented, transcribed, translated, circulated, and then incorporated into distinct projects, those original sources are at times obscured. But when we engage carefully with the text at hand, indigenous knowledge can be teased out of these interstitial points where the original source and the knowledge it embodies make themselves apparent. Cortez's 1519 expedition to the mainland of what is now Mexico and his defeat and subjugation of Tenochtitlan 2 years later remain touchstones for the imagining and retelling of the continuities and disruptions that his endeavors signaled for the peoples and nations he encountered. Historical narratives of the conquest of Mexico have always rested on a range of sources that became more referential and layered as the decades and centuries went by. There is a genealogy of sources that is most evident and studied in the Spanish accounts. Francisco López de Gómara's Conquista de Mexico engages with Cortez's urtext in an adulatory fashion, while Bernal Díaz del Castillo's Historia Verdadera de la Conquista offers a more revisionist response to Cortez's aggressively first-person account of events. Texts that are generally regarded as representing indigenous perspective and knowledge, such as those found in Miguel León Portilla's 1959 volume, Visión de los Vencidos, translated into English as The Broken Spears, are no less intertextual. Layers of references undergird key native-informed accounts. Today, we'll look at the work of two authors who wrote multiple versions of the conquest. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún's work on Book 12 of the Florentine Codex was followed by his 1585 revision of the conquest account, which was the only portion of the monumental work that he revised. Sarah Klein points out in her introduction to the translation of the text that it represented Sahagún's own interpretation of the conquest. The historian of Texcoco, Don Fernando de Albaicízotl, offers two distinct renditions of the conquest in his 13th relation of the Compendio Histórico and his magnum opus, Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, both of which drew from a variety of native and non-native sources. Sahagún's and Alba Isíxóchil's access to indigenous knowledge is undeniable and well documented. It is also constructed as a trope that we could call the trope of authenticity, a recurring motif in their works where the authenticity of the sources and genealogy of that native knowledge is an authorizing feature of the text. Teasing out the native sources and perspectives that are embedded in these texts and the ways in which they are engaged and deployed by the authors helps us to gain greater understanding of how indigenous knowledge contributed to foundational histories from colonial Mexico. The work I present today has grown out of a close rereading of texts by Alba Isíxóchil for two collaborative translation projects that Kim mentioned in the introductory remarks with Bradley Benton, Pablo Garcia Loaiza, and Peter Villela. As we have worked through the 13th relation of the Compendio Histórico and the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca together, we have noticed with more collective clarity the ways in which Alba Isíxóchil drew from, relied on, and dialogued with pictorial sources for the pre-Hispanic history and alphabetic sources for the Conquest era history. I also offer thanks to Wayne Ruitt, who is missed. In one of our conversations about colonial manuscripts, he mentioned to me the earliest known copy of Sahagún's 1585 revision, which is housed in the Montserrat Library outside of Barcelona. That copy was the basis for the 19th century manuscript copy ordered by William H. Prescott, which is now found in the Boston Public Library and provides the source for the Klein edition. Wayne, we can also recall, found the original Alba Isíxóchil manuscripts, which are incorporated into 3 volumes of autograph indigenous authored manuscripts that are now housed in INA's library in Mexico City under the title Códice Chimalpain, after having spent nearly 200 years as part of the Bible Society collection in England. I mentioned briefly and in passing these manuscripts and where they are located as a reminder that indigenous knowledge travels and has impact far beyond its original place of production. Sahagún places his native sources front and center in the title of his 1585 revision. Account of the conquest of this new Spain as the Indian soldiers who were present told it, translated into Spanish, plain and intelligible, in the year 1585. The native perspective is foundational to his narrative, which is a point he elaborates in the opening paragraph, where he writes that he had written the 12 books, what we now know as the Florentine Codex, in Tlatelolco, and that, as he says, and here I quote, "Those who helped me write it were prominent elders, well-versed in all matters relating not only to idolatry, but to government and its offices, who were present in the war when the city was conquered." In these early pages, Sahagún also makes clear his objective for revising the history of the conquest. "It has been determined," he says, "that our Lord God purposely kept secret this hidden portion of the world until these times, and that his divine commandment has seen fit to reveal it to the Roman Catholic Church, not with the objective that its inhabitants be destroyed and depressed, but rather that they be brought out of the darkness of idolatry in which they have lived, and be brought into the Catholic Church and instructed in the Christian religion, in order to reach heaven by dying in the faith of true Christians." Sarah Klein has suggested that this enhanced evangelical tone is the product of a heightened and politically charged series of conflicts within the Church in New Spain. The changes in the 1585 revision, she says, are the product of a climate increasingly hostile to the early evangelical Franciscans and designed to alert the reader to the importance of the military conquest of New Spain, led by Cortés, and the contributions of the Franciscan order to the spiritual conquest. where Sahagún's narrative is motivated by the political context underpinning the evangelical project, Alba Isisotxil's narrative, written several decades later, has the stated goal of preserving Native history. We find an example of this in the prologue to the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, where he bemoans the impact of the conquest and the loss of his ancestors' way of life and the knowledge and traditions they had developed. Time changed all of this. With the fall of the kings and lords mentioned above, the travails and persecutions of their descendants, and the calamity suffered by their subjects and vassals, not only did they abandon what was good and not contrary to our Catholic faith, but the majority of their histories were recklessly and heedlessly burned by orders of the first friars. This was one of the greatest losses suffered in this new Spain. All of the aforementioned books, texts, and materials were kept in the royal archives in the city of Texcoco, as it was the center of all their knowledge, traditions, and mores, because its kings prided themselves on this, and they were the lawmakers of the New World. The materials that escaped the fires and calamities, and that my ancestors kept safe, came to me. Alba Isisotxil's central project is to preserve this knowledge that was quickly being lost. He had access to and utilized a variety of sources produced by natives, including oral, pictorial, and alphabetic. The Historia de la Nación Chichimeca extensively treats the pre-Hispanic history of Anáhuac, or Central Mexico, and in the final chapters, he addresses the conquest. The narrative ends abruptly, mid-sentence, during the siege of Tenochtitlan, and in this section, we find evidence of a range of material that he used to construct the narrative, including both Spanish and native sources. Though even when he engages with Spanish histories, indigenous knowledge emerges from his narrative. At various points in his writings, Alba Isisotxil remarks that Gómara is the most reliable of the generally unreliable Spanish chroniclers. In 1552, Francisco López de Gómara published his influential history, Historia de las Indias y Conquista de México. The following year, the book was censored by royal decree. Despite the banning of Historia de las Indias, the text did in fact circulate and was read by numerous historians, including Alba Isisotxil and his contemporary, the Nahua historian, Don Domingo de San Antón Muñón Chimalpain Cuatlewanitzin, who produced a copy of the second part, the Conquista de México, that registers changes and corrections to the original. Susan Schroeder, Cristian Roa de la Carrera, David Tavares, and Anne Cruz's 2010 English translation of this text allows the reader to see the sometimes subtle ways in which Chimalpain responded to Gómara's narrative. In Chimalpain's copy of Gómara, as we shall see in Alba Isisotxil as well, indigenous knowledge is constructed in dialogue with Spanish discourses and narrative. In the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, Alba suggests there is a distinction between those historians who represent Spanish history and himself, as someone who relies on native sources. For instance, as part of his narrative of the conquest, in chapter 90, he states that Gómara, Antonio de Herrera, Juan de Torquemada, and Hernando Cortés address very clearly things about our Spaniards, las cosas de nuestros españoles, and curious readers will find in them all they may desire. Alba Isisotxil, however, says of himself, "In everything I have written and shall write, I follow the histories and paintings written by the native lords." These comments belie the fact that Alba Isisotxil did more than read the Spanish historians. He borrowed from their works as he constructed his own. As he introduces the figure of Hernando Cortés in chapter 77 of the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, he is clearly borrowing from Gómara. Alba says, "The Catholic monarchs, Don Fernando and Doña Isabel, reigned in Castile and Aragon when Hernando Cortés was born in the town of Medellín in Extremadura, and the year was 1485, as previously mentioned. His parents were Martín Cortés de Monroy and Doña Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, both highborn and of noble stock and very honorable, though they had little wealth. As the following passage makes clear, Alba Isisotl was reading Gómara, who opens the second part of the Historia General de las Indias with these lines about Cortés. And here I cite from Schroeder's translation. Hernando Cortés was born in Medellín, Extremadura, in 1485, during the reign of Fernando and Isabel, the Catholic monarchs of Castile and Aragon. His father was Martín Cortés de Monroy and his mother, Doña Catalina Pizarro Altamirano. Both parents came from noble stock, since all four lineages, Cortés, Monroy, Pizarro, Altamirano, are ancient and honorable. Although they owned little in the way of property, they attained much honor, as rarely happens but to those who lead a good life. We should note that chapter 77 in the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca marks the beginning of Alba Isisotl's narrative of Cortés's arrival and the subsequent events related to the conquest of Anahuac, just as the passage from Gómara marks the beginning of his narrative of the conquest of Mexico. And Alba Isisotl cribbed Gómara's opening lines. He continued to borrow from the Spanish chronicler throughout the final section of the text. But there's a key difference in Alba Isisotl's rendering of Gómara in this passage, and others as well. The interjection, como atrás queda referido, as mentioned previously, represents the author's own words, and they're important. In chapter 69, Alba Isisotl writes about the birth of his namesake, the valerosísimo infante Isisotl, the most brave prince Isisotl. And he situates the birth in relation to other important births. Isisotl was born in 1500, the same year as Carlos V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And as Alba says, both were instrumental in building and spreading the Holy Catholic faith. Through a rhetorical sleight of hand, Alba Isisotl then goes on to associate the greatness of his ancestor Isisotl with the greatness of Cortés. He does not go so far as to diminish Cortés's role in the spread of Catholicism, as he does in the 13th relation, where he places Isisotl next to God as the most influential figure in the evangelization of the New World. Cortés was born in 1485, 15 years before Isisotl and Carlos V, and in the same year as Martin Luther, who, according to Alba, sought to sully and undo the Catholic Church. The message is clear. Isisotl is grouped with the great promoters of Catholicism of the era, Carlos V and Cortés, and he's distinguished from the wicked and depraved Martin Luther. When Alba Isisotl presents Prince Isisotl in the chapter that addresses his birth, and then later makes a reference to that passage in the chapter that deals with Cortés's birth, he suggests a deep connection between the two men. Born within a generation of each other, these two men, in Alba's presentation in the text, were instrumental in the spread of Catholicism in the New World. Here, I would like to suggest that it is too simple to note that in the Historia de la Nación Chichimeca, Alba Isisotl derives part of his narrative from Gómara. In fact, these borrowings are accompanied by significant commentary on the source. Whereas in Gómara, the great hero is first and foremost and always Cortés, in Alba Isisotl's estimation, Cortés would not have accomplished what he did without the aid of Isisotl, his very own native ancestor from Texcoco. And this the author knows through his access to local Texcoco knowledge of events. Thus, even in a section of the text that is so clearly derived from a Spanish source, Alba Isisotl modifies the original intent of the source by offering a native perspective on events, and by doing so, evidence of indigenous knowledge, in this case, knowledge of a key historical figure. Where Alba Isisotl sought to preserve indigenous knowledge during a time of cultural loss, Sahagún was motivated to rewrite the conquest story for political reasons related to the evangelical project. We capture the appearance of a native source in his description of the massacre in the main temple of Tenochtitlan during the Toxcatl festival. This violent event, occurring in May of 1520, precipitated the ouster of the Spaniards and their allies from Tenochtitlan during the famed Noche Triste on the last night of June in the same year. In Sahagún's rendition, the unharmed attendees were attacked on orders from Pedro de Alvarado, known in Nahuatl as Tonatiuh, without warning, and many high-ranking natives were killed. Chapter 20 of both the Florentine Codex and Sahagún's 1585 revision addressed the massacre, though with distinctly different perspectives. Whereas the Florentine Codex begins rather neutrally, and here I cite from Lacarte's English translation of the text, at the time that seemed opportune to them, the Spaniards came out from where they had been and took all the gates to the square so that no one could get out. The 1585 revision opens with this sentence: "The greatest evil that one can do to another is to take his life when the victim is in mortal sin. This is what the Spaniards did to the Mexican Indians because they provoked them by being faithless in honoring their idols." The Indians, according to Sahagún in this text, provoked the Spaniards, and thus were also to blame for the massacre. Concerns of faith were central to Sahagún's revisions in the 1585 text. In her introduction, Klein enumerates key differences between the Florentine Codex and the 1585 revision. Significant among them, she says, the narrative point of view is that of the Spaniards and not the natives, and by extension, a justification of their actions. These prefatory and indicting comments, clearly in Sahagún's voice, are not present in the Florentine Codex. They also make the native elements of the story stand out in greater relief in the later text. Though not altogether distinct from a similar passage in the Florentine Codex, the following horrific description of the massacre is in tone and content unlike Sahagún's prefatory remarks. "So great was the bloodshed that rivulets of blood ran through the courtyard like water in a heavy rain. So great was the slime of blood and entrails in the courtyard, and so great was the stench that it was both terrifying and heartrending. Now that nearly all were fallen and dead, the Spaniards went searching for those who had climbed up the temple and those who had hidden among the dead, killing all those they found alive." Though Sahagún's framing of the evocative description attempts to ascribe blame to the native participants in the Toxcatl festival, the passage itself speaks so directly and poignantly of the native experience that it stands apart, and powerfully so, from that critical context. A rendition of this passage, for which he cites Sahagún as a source, is also found in Prescott's Conquest of Mexico. Prescott writes, "The pavement," says a writer of the age, "ran with streams of blood, like water in a heavy shower. Not an Aztec of all that gay company was left alive." This 19th century history registers the eyewitness experience of the massacre. We can trace the citation back to Sahagún's 1585 revision and in turn back to the natives who were present and experienced the suffering caused by Alvarado and his men. Indigenous knowledge is retained, even as Prescott himself suggests in an ominous tone that the Spaniards had destroyed the Aztecs to a last man. In the introduction to their 2014 edited volume, Indigenous Intellectuals, Knowledge, Power, and Colonial Culture in Mexico and the Andes, Gabriela Ramos and Yana Yanakakis say that, and here I quote briefly from the introduction, "Indigenous forms of knowledge were embedded in deep and wide-ranging contexts of ritual practice and social and cultural authority. Thus, the historical traces of this knowledge, primarily in written form, lack the crucial context in which they were produced." The examples of indigenous knowledge I've sought to highlight today are removed at least one step from their original contexts of production. No doubt we will move closer to those original contexts in other presentations during this symposium. My intention has been to show that indigenous knowledge did travel and is registered in text produced at a remove from the native communities, such as Prescott's. While Sahagún's 1585 revision of Book 12 of the Florentine Codex puts into greater relief the native sources and stories that are incorporated into his narrative, Alba Isisotl reminds us that even in those moments in the text, when he relied on Spanish sources, the knowledge and perspective of his indigenous ancestors shines through. In my work on the Native Archive, and here I'll end, I've invoked the term archive as in an intentional way, as a means of suggesting that the collection of indigenous pictorial and alphabetic texts as a native archive allows us to place emphasis on the ways in which the native community and native identified scholars established not only a corpus of materials that would become foundational to Mexican historiography, but also a means of interpreting those materials and giving them meaning and authority in colonial Mexico. Indigenous knowledge is intimately tied to this process. By looking carefully at the ways in which the native perspective and experience are integrated into Sahagún's and Alba Isisotl's conquest narratives, and the narrative strategies deployed by each author, we can pinpoint places in the text where that indigenous knowledge is made manifest. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful. Next up is Kelly McDonough. She's Assistant Professor of Latin American Literary and Cultural Studies and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. Her primary areas of expertise include critical indigenous studies, ethnohistory, Latin American colonial literatures. She's the author of The Learned Ones, Nahua Intellectuals in Post-Conquest Mexico from 2014, and various articles on indigenous literacies, inter-indigenous class conflict, indigenous narrative mapping, and contemporary Mexican indigenous literatures. Her current book in progress, Water, Earth, Air, and Fire, Thinking Indigenous Mexico Through the Four Elements, is a multidisciplinary analysis of Nahua entanglements with diverse manifestations of the four elements during the colonial period and today. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm so very honored to be here with this group of very esteemed colleagues. I feel like it's a gift to be here with you, especially in light of recent events. And I want to say that I'm absolutely in awe of Kim, Daniela, Amy, and Chelsea. And they have given us an example of how you get things done. It's really been extraordinary. So I do want to express my gratitude to Kim and Daniela for organizing this event, the USC-Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute, the Seaver Institute, and of course the Getty Research Institute for sponsoring it. I'd also like to recognize the Gabrieleño Tongva people upon whose ancestral lands we are gathered here today. So I think I pressed the button. I do press the button. My talk today is reframing the Relaciones Geográficas of Colonial Mexico, a corpus view of indigenous knowledges. So when we think about and study indigenous knowledges in Mexico, past or present, what quickly comes to mind is, nobody's gonna answer? The Florentine Codex. Thank you. Thank you. The 12-book encyclopedic masterpiece created, as many of you know, in the mid-late 16th century by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún and Nahua collaborators. And both quality and quantity of details related to Aztec or Mexica, pre-Hispanic and early colonial life, it is thought to be unparalleled. But a growing body of scholarship, visible in the richness of this symposium's offerings, shows that there are many, many more sources and approaches that can inform our understandings of Indigenous knowledges, how they were produced and circulated, and how this production and circulation was part and parcel of the material and intellectual construction of the colonial world. In my time today, I would like to turn our attention to another ambitious 16th century project that likewise gathered a host of information from and about Indigenous peoples, and in this case of New Spain, the Relaciones Geográficas surveys. And instead of saying Relaciones Geográficas like 100 times, I'm going to say RGs. So that's what I mean when I'm saying RGs. The RGs were ordered in 1577 by King Philip II. These surveys, I argue, offer valuable insight to Indigenous knowledges of pre-Hispanic and colonial Mexico, insights that can complement and build upon such sources as the Florentine Codex. Juan López de Velasco, head cosmographer and chronicler of the Council of Indies, crafted the 1577 RG Questionnaire based on nearly a century's worth of data gathering practices used to report details of the so-called New World to the Crown. Like Sahagún's project, the RGs functioned as a sort of net to capture details of all aspects of colonial life. The 50 questions, and this is moving on its own. My goodness, you've seen all kinds of things. How do I stop it from moving on its own?
Sometimes when you do a test run, you leave the timer on. You have to take out the timer.
He's got me. So now you've had a preview of everything I'm going to talk about. Well, I'm going to keep going, right? The RG questionnaire is known to be 50 questions, but actually it's quite a few more than that. It's around 200 questions. Is this? No, now I'm in the wrong. Okay, I'm just going to keep going. It doesn't matter. So it's really 200 questions that consider a whole range of political, economic, environmental, and social topics. For example, many questions elicited related to pre-Hispanic life, asking questions about Indigenous rulers, military alliances, and religious practices. Some set their sights on physical terrain. What was the flora and fauna like? What kinds of mineral resources were there? And yet others centered on the people themselves, their languages, their social practices, and even their physical health. The data was theoretically destined to be source material for an exhaustive chronicle/atlas of the Spanish Empire, one that would orient best governance and effective utilization of the people, places, and things that the Crown claimed as its own. It doesn't matter, I don't need it. Of the 208 surveys that were returned from the Americas, only a small fraction of the questionnaires originally distributed. The vast majority, 167, came from New Spain. Due to the breadth and depth of data collected from the 1577 RGs, and I keep saying 1577 because there were consecutive surveys that happened. The New Spain corpus is over 1,000 manuscript pages alone. These are invaluable resources for studies of the colonial world. While regularly consulted, for the most part, RGs have served as secondary sources. Oh, we're right there. With few taking the RG corpus itself as the object of study. And I'll talk about that briefly, but I want to explain why a corpus approach and why I'm talking about we need to do a corpus approach. Anybody that's worked with the RGs knows that they are anything but uniform. There's no uniformity in the way that people responded to these questionnaires. So one might answer the questions related to social norms and really give a lot of detail, and then maybe talk a little bit about flora and fauna, and then just completely skip 5, 6, 7 questions. We have other RGs that have page after page of pre-Hispanic history, and then again, skip half of the questionnaire. So really, as historian Madeline Nichols pointed out in 1944, she said, the very number of accounts compensates for the many weaknesses of the individual RGs. She likens the RGs to pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that once put together can provide a much more complete view of a region or a specific topic. So the productivity of this, putting the pieces of the puzzle back together, this corpus approach, is evidenced in not a great deal of scholarship, but we've seen Alejandra Moreno Toscano's 1968 study of economic geography of New Spain. There have been really important descriptive works in the Handbook of Middle American Indians by Klein, Robertson, and Harvey. And more recently, in 2002, Barry Isaac looked to the RG corpus of New Spain in, I think it was just New Spain. He focused on reports of human sacrifice and ritual consumption of human flesh and how indigenous people were reporting that. And then in 2015, this is an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary research project. He looked to the RGs for how indigenous people talked about disease and population decline in the 16th century. Because a lot of the questions say, and it's starting on its own again, a lot of the questions ask about, are there more people or less people here, and do you know why? And so we have this body of material that is actual indigenous testimony for this calamity that we haven't seen this much data before. So there's a lot to be seen yet in the RGs. And of course, the RG maps, let's see, okay. So, well, Barbara Mundy's 1996 expert analysis of the beautiful maps that accompanied many RGs has revealed indigenous aesthetics and worldviews, and you saw that image of that map, which I believe Daniela is at the Huntington on loan, and I just found out about that yesterday. I'm so sorry, but I actually have quite a few images of this. So go to the Huntington, you can see it in person. A systematic focus on indigenous knowledge is embedded in the written manuscripts of the RG corpus, yet awaits. So I propose we begin such a study by asking two questions. One, how were indigenous knowledges collected, recorded, and produced in the RGs? Basically, what was this context? And two, what types of knowledges can we find in the RGs? So first I need to explain, though, as Amber did really wonderfully, what I mean by indigenous knowledges. And for me, the term indigenous knowledges is shorthand. It's shorthand for both knowing, understanding, for knowing, understanding how, when, why, where, who, what, and then also the processes and the practices that produce, keep, and convey cultural. There we go. Produce, keep, and convey cultural knowledges. More often than not, indigenous knowledges, in my way of thinking, is gained through personal experience. And as Shawnee, Sac and Fox, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole scholar Donald Fixico maintains, these knowledges are often aimed at benefiting the people. With this in mind, the term indigenous knowledges could refer to social memory, could refer to medicine, engineering, arts, governance, to name only a few. And I think we're going to see in these next 2 days all kinds of different approaches to indigenous knowledges. And I'm really interested to learn from my colleagues about how they are conceptualizing this, and if I'm going in the right direction, we can definitely talk about this. So on the first point, how were these knowledges collected and recorded, produced in the RGs? Yes. Oh, it's going again. I think I should just turn it off. We should just turn it off. Okay, so how were they, what was the specific context? So local Spanish authorities were charged with completing the questionnaire and returning it to Madrid in good haste, since they were ordered by the Crown to consult, quote, personas inteligentes de las cosas de la tierra, people informed about the things of the land. Most of the RGs show collaboration with local Indigenous authorities, all Indigenous men who are deemed knowledgeable on the topics under scrutiny. I want to note that in the New Spain Corpus, in the Archdiocese of Mexico Corpus, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, the only RG that did not collaborate with Indigenous people to create to respond to the questionnaire was Iguala. And this particular corregidor in the Iguala manuscript writes about extreme tensions with the Indigenous people of that community, and I think that's what we have seen with Ayotzinapa here today. So I think there's something to be said. There's something to be related with that RG and contemporary Indigenous experience. So. With few exceptions, the RGs are composite texts of many minds and many hands, collages of voices that register meaning makers in the plural. At the table were Spanish and Indigenous authorities, native language interpreters, scribes who recorded the various voices, and often a local priest. And since the entire process took place in a public setting, we can imagine that the eyes and ears of silent stakeholders played a part in shaping the narrative ultimately put to paper. This was, in a sense, an open-air negotiation of relationships across cultures and classes, since all present had to be generally on the same page when the ink was going to the paper. So, as Duccio Sacchi points out, as this territorial order was being formalized in this written narrative, Indigenous people were able to confirm their rights in writing and along with the corregidor's approval. This was what was being sent back to the King of Spain. So the exact methods of data collection in each case are quite difficult to pin down, although sometimes the more diligent scribes remind us of the back and forth questioning through an interpreter. In the Archdiocese of Mexico Corpus, for example, there are 31 RGs and there are 9 languages that are represented in these documents. So there are many languages in each community. There are many interpreters, but the diligent scribe will say, "Dijeron que," they said that, or "Y esto respondieron a la pregunta." This is how they answered the question. So it would be heavy-handed to state that every iteration after "Dijeron que" was in the RGs is an example of Indigenous knowledge. However, I do agree with Sacchi's observation that the questionnaires must be considered not only as an instrument for gathering information, but also as a tool for producing information. Occasionally, we can steal glimpses behind the curtains with mentions of the painted books and oral histories that the Indigenous men consulted as they generated their responses. In this way, the RGs document earlier Indigenous knowledge practices. But the RG process was also one of Indigenous knowledge production in that present moment. It's hard to imagine that Indigenous authorities were automatons supplying any and all information requested or pulling their answers randomly out of thin air. We can safely assume that they contemplated and chose their words carefully. We must also remember that Indigenous people were not the only ones providing information in this setting. Through the survey itself and the data collection experience, Spaniards were revealing what was of most concern or importance to them. Indigenous people were surely gathering their own data that would further shape their future thoughts and actions as colonial subjects. So as one of the earlier crowdsourcing projects, and I'm trying to decide if I can say it's the earliest crowdsourcing project, but I'm not sure yet, but as one of the earlier crowdsourcing projects, miscommunications were guaranteed as information moved between various power players through multiple languages and through individual cultural filters. All parties would have consciously or unconsciously crafted their own narratives by highlighting certain points and remaining silent on others. Serge Grzinski's concern about the validity and quality of the data collected in such conditions is not without merit, but I'm less concerned engaging what might have been if not for the asymmetrical power relations at play, such as what would the Indigenous people really have said. I am really more interested in addressing simply what made it to the page in this unique situation. So my ultimate goal is to analyze indigenous knowledges in the complete New Spain corpus, so 167 manuscripts. You can see the breakdown here: Michoacán, Guadalajara, Antequera, which is Oaxaca, Tlaxcala, Yucatan, and Guatemala. And then ideally be able to do a comparison with the South American, the 40 South American RGs, and then the one lone RG from the Caribbean, which is from Puerto Rico. But today, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to the Archdiocese of Mexico corpus. Oh, it was time though. A group of 31. So my present approach to thinking about and identifying indigenous knowledge in the RGs is through a dynamic and overlapping three-sphere taxonomy, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of places, actions, ideas, and actors. The first sphere gathers local or empirical knowledges related to land, animals, and deities. And here we might look to land memory. With attention to toponyms and the stories attached to them, we can recreate indigenous, it's on its own, but this is good, indigenous narrative maps. Place names index locations and geographic features, but they also mark sacred space, encounters with deities, animals, and humans, as well as other meaningful events. In the words of J.T. Johnson, place names give insight to a way of understanding, knowing, and learning about the world. And this is just an excerpt from the Relación de Mestitlan, where they're explaining why it's called Mestitlan. And we see a lot of these kinds of studies, but there's actually a great deal of information, a great deal of history that is in the RGs related to place names. And so they're explaining, we had nighttime assaults in our earlier experiences with war with others, so we called them, they did it by the light of the moon, so there's that, those of the moon. And then there's another explanation, and that's that there is a, is this the pointer? There is a moon on the side of one of the largest Tepet, one of the largest cerros in the region, that they cannot answer to why that moon is there, who created it, and that it was perhaps early ancestors or otherworldly beings. So the second sphere centered on practices, tools. Can I go back? So the second sphere I'm calling resources right now, and that is centering on practices, tools, and techniques, especially those pertaining to resource management. So a rich example can be drawn from the salt making and salt protecting practices in 4 pueblos of the Archdiocese of Mexico. The RGs of Temascaltepec, Tecaputzalco, Alaustlan, and Austuma all detail the process involved in cultivating their precious currency, their salt. So I mentioned salt protecting, since each also describes moats and strategically placed trenches, initially built to guard their salt from the Purépecha in pre-Hispanic times. Salt became only more valuable, we know, with the advent of the patio process of extracting silver from ground ore. And what we read in the RGs is that in the late 16th century, these moats and trenches were still being maintained. The third sphere considers institutions, entre comillas, including social memory, creativity, and rules in use that teach, regulate, and modify social norms, codes, and relationships. So in this sphere, we might find community histories, crime, punishment, judges and justice, regalia and featherwork, ideas about birth, child rearing, family formation and death, and then intergenerational learning spaces such as the hearth or the Calmecac. Religious or ceremonial practice could register in this third sphere. At the same time, if we consider that many aspects of indigenous ritual life were related to the agricultural cycle, and here I'm thinking about petitions for rain, rituals can also be thought of as a resource management technique, or for that matter, local knowledge. Here we can see that the taxonomic spheres are not final receptacles meant to harness or codify knowledges, they're thinking devices to continue their exploration. Many of the indigenous knowledges in the RGs are only fleeting references. Here I'm thinking of Tolnacuchtla's ingenious technique of water management. In the region of Tolnacuchtla, they were dedicated to henequen cultivation, and what they did, they made canals out of braided henequen rope. So all of their water management was with braided henequen rope. We could also look to the multicolored pottery of Citla Tomawa, which they traded for salt and cacao, or the countless references, but very little detail, of song and dance. While the RGs yield little on these topics, they can help us generate more questions and provoke further research in other sources. As a manner of moving to close, I'll now turn to an RG topic that very easily floats between the three spheres: indigenous herbal medicines. Nope. There. So there are two questions in the RG questionnaire number 17 and number 26. Number 17 has a host of other questions in it, but at the very end, it is asking about health, illnesses, and remedies used to treat illnesses. And then question 26 is very brief. This is the whole question: the herbs and aromatic plants used by the Indians to cure and the medicinal or poisonous properties of them. So these two are aimed at learning about plant life utilized by indigenous peoples to heal and to poison, which is another really interesting category to explore. The Archdiocese of Mexico Corpus alone boasts nearly 100 herbal medicines. Plant life was harnessed to relieve headaches, indigestion, insomnia. How many of you have any of those? Because I have a list of things that can help you. And muscle pains, to cure head colds, urinary tract infections, dysentery, and even plague and hemorrhagic fevers. Suchimecatle reversed mal de ojo, evil eye, and Masanenepili cured calor de hígado, excessive fire in the liver, manifesting in an angry disposition. And that's one that we might want to keep in our back pocket when we're having difficult meetings at work, or we can pass along some Masanenepili. I'm gonna go back to Huastepec, I believe. There we are. The Altepec of Huastepec is renowned for its extensive pre-Hispanic and post-conquest gardens. And you can see down here the depiction of the gardens. Huastepec is an interesting case because it really focuses on herbal therapies geared toward women. So they talk about breast tenderness, being alleviated with the petals of flowers such as suchicocot or tecomosochitl, and then they also talk about cuapatle rue, which was used at that time, as it continues to be, to work pregnancies or prompt labor. Both the RGs of Alahuistlan and Texcoco mention therapeutic uses of oliliki, the powerful hallucinogenic mushroom that by the 17th century would be considered a key component of demonic rituals. However, here in the RGs, we see that oliliki had powerful therapeutic uses and proven success in alleviating pain and swelling resulting from blows or beatings. Of course, the RGs are not a comprehensive source for herbal knowledges, but they do add crucial information that can be interleaved with other sources such as Historia de las Plantas de Nueva España by Francisco Hernández, which was about I want to say 7-year project that started maybe 10 years before this particular RG, where he gathered thousands of He recorded thousands of uses of plant life and their curative properties. So we could interleave with Francisco Hernández, which is an interesting process too, especially with all of these mentions of women's medicine, to see where he is talking about the same herb, but not necessarily talking about that property. So we can bring together all of those possible uses. The Florentine Codex mentions 150 herbs and associated medicinal practices. And then there are other colonial sources that have, of course, the Codex Badianus, which I believe some others will be speaking about in these next 2 days. There are some mentions in the Codex Mendoza, and then also the Matricula de Tributos. So compiling and comparing all of the available sources will be key in reconstructing a comprehensive indigenous pharmacopoeia of New Spain. And here I want to mention that Paula DeVos at SDSU has taken up the Herculean task of recreating a pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican pharmacopoeia to compare it to its European Mediterranean counterpart. So keep an eye out for that. She's working very hard at that. Ethnobotanists, of course, would be interested in learning about herbs and applications found in the RGs, but not in other sources, and confirming their properties as we continue to seek new cures for diseases. Perhaps more importantly, though, Indigenous peoples today can use the RGs and the above-mentioned sources to recover or solidify medicinal practices in their own communities. Robert Bay and Eldemira Linares, both ethnobotanists, insist that those of us who work with such materials can and should collaborate with contemporary Indigenous communities, ensuring access to the sources and also sharing our methods of analysis. These kinds of return projects, they argue, not only benefit the many Mesoamerican communities searching to rescue and fortify their cultural roots, but also offer contemporary society alternatives to plan for the future. So a very, very small return project and hopefully recovery project has the RG manuscripts circulating again in the present. About a year ago, I asked a colleague and friend of mine, Sabina de la Cruz, who is a native speaker of Nahuatl, who was teaching Nahuatl classes at UT, if she would be interested in taking a closer look with me at Nahuatl language the terms that we were seeing in the RGs. She was immediately drawn to this topic of herbal medicine. Not long after this, she began to organize a research project on present-day illnesses and plant knowledges in her own community, Tecomate, which is a tiny hamlet in the Huasteca of Veracruz, Mexico. She's using the data from the RGs to tease out the presence and uses of herbal medicines in her discussions with elders in her community. Here's a short example of her work published in the Nahuatl journal, fittingly called Yolitia, Our Roots. Her essay, Cocolistitlenachica Tempano, Frequent Illnesses, describes illnesses and herbal medicines drawn from the surrounding region, including their preparations. While she's only identified 32, we were very excited to see that only 3 overlapped with data found in the Archdiocese of Mexico, Corpus. So she is from Chicontepec, which is up here. And at first we wanted to see overlapping. We wanted to see these RGs, these herbal medicines that are mentioned in the past, they're still being used, which some of that is, but what's exciting is there are a host of herbal medicines that we don't have record of, that we can, again, interleave with these other sources. So, in the end, Lopez de Velasco's ambitious goal for a comprehensive atlas never did come to fruition. The RGs, in fact, sat untouched, gathering dust in archives for hundreds of years. But today in the 21st century, the RG manuscripts are beginning to circulate and put to use in ways that Lopez de Velasco could not have anticipated. The very tool designed to know as much as possible about colonial subjects and territories is now in the hands of still colonial subjects, relearning about themselves and the spaces they are reclaiming as their own. The end result of these old Indigenous knowledges circulating and new ones with it, emerging with it, has yet to be seen. But we can say with confidence that Indigenous knowledges, as they have always done, persist. Thank you.
Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. They went far beyond at least my expectations. So it's and they. No. But it's things that we're wrestling with, the things that we dealt with in our exhibitions, but also in one of our new research projects on the Florentine Codex. So you touched on many of these aspects, so I was thrilled that we can bring this all in conversation. I'm especially struck, and this is something that we're talking about in our project as well, about these indigenous sources that, as you both have touched upon, they were written in the 16th century during the colonial period by indigenous authors, but then they disappear, so from sight. And they go into European repositories and then only are later rediscovered. And so I was curious, you have talked about how these indigenous narratives are fundamental to the shaping of official narratives of the conquest, and in your case about various different types of knowledge. But it's interesting to see this sort of from a historical perspective and how they have their moments of influence. And so maybe you can talk about this, and when do we see these manuscripts come back to light, and how they then have been sort of reinterpreted, and what they mean to modern scholarship today as opposed to the scholarship that was being done in the 16th century. So it's sort of this process of sort of re-emergence that I find quite interesting.
Is this, okay, this is on, I believe. I'm excited for these opportunities to process collectively. I think that's a really wonderful feature of this symposium, and we can take a stab at some of these big picture issues here, but I hope we can continue that conversation in other contexts as well. For me, the question of sources and the journeys of those sources and the access to those sources, deployment of those sources at different moments in time and different contexts is a topic that I find very crucial for understanding the way in which history has been written. And I think the question of indigenous knowledge is fundamental and key to that. I think that this is something that perhaps maybe does not get the kind of attention that it should. And this is in part why I started off with Prescott. This is an iconic 19th century American historian who relied tremendously on what I would consider indigenous sources and indigenous forms of knowledge. And yet that is not necessarily how his work would be perceived or pitched. So I think there are ways in which these 16th century sources get woven back into other historical projects at different moments in time. I would also say that we need to very much contextualize those projects. We shan't be naive and believe that just because these original sources reappear at other moments, that they have the same significance, carry the same weight, are given the same import. But there is an important journey to be traced that it ties into some of the questions that arose as you all were organizing the exhibitions as well, and that ties into some extent with what Kelly discussed too, that capturing knowledge and then reaccessing that knowledge at other moments it is an important and central process. I would say, if you want to. I don't know if that's something that
Hi.
Connects.
Hi. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and really to be with Amber, to be able to really bounce off each other a little bit. That's great. I want to note that there is not a single RG in its place of origin. We have 43 at the University of Texas at Austin, and the rest are in Seville and Madrid. The Seville and Madrid manuscripts are sometimes available and sometimes not. The RG manuscripts at UT Austin are available in rare books. One of the things that we're grappling with at Lelas Benson, at the Benson Collection, is archival responsibility. And what do? We have, for example, a fragment of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, and it is never going back to Tlaxcala. It's so valuable to the university now, and folks that don't work in archives, that aren't humanists, that are in administration only see the dollar amount, and that's the way it is. So what is our responsibility as scholars and archivists when we are holding someone else's cultural patrimony? How do we deal with that? One of the things that we've started to do with the RGs is making facsimiles of the maps and then reconnecting with these communities. And I have done that with Cholula and have had just marvelous results from that. And it's not because we have repatriated anything. And I think there was some thought that, if we give them a digital copy and we give them a facsimile, then it's done. Then we've due process and we can go about our business. And I'm of the mind that this is really the digital repatriation or the facsimile is about starting a conversation. And a conversation that we probably won't come to a great solution, but we have to have these difficult conversations. So we are now putting the RGs online. We are working with students to develop projects to take the RGs back to Mexico. And we're also working on creating grants for people that are from those communities to come and study their work. So that's a tricky one. And that's what you're dealing with here, right?
Right, and it's also about, so digital repatriation is of course a key word, and I don't know if you all are familiar with the Digital Codex Mendoza, which it's such a wonderful project. It puts the whole Codex Mendoza that's at the Bodleian Library in Oxford online, and it has the interpretations that were published in 1992 in English and Spanish from Patty Annewald and Francis Bourdain were used to animate and create sort of an interactive document that you can read it in various languages, and so really wonderful. And they call that also digital repatriation. Yeah. And I think this is such an interesting concept, and to what degree is that, as you say, sort of enough, or to what degree does that begin the conversation, which I think is really interesting. But then also sort of the history of publication of these documents and how they're published. Frequently, then the texts are privileged over the images, right? And so they pull out the text, publish them, but then the images are not really always included. Mm-hmm. We're talking about this with the Florentine Codex, but you need this context, these different types of knowledges, how they're encoded to have the fuller picture, even if it's fragmentary, as you're saying with the RGs. So this is the history as well for the RGs, right? Right, absolutely. Yeah, and absolutely. The sequence, the history of these publications and when they become accessible is an interesting one. Yeah, and the RGs have had sort of an odd ride in terms of publication, in that pieces of the RGs over the years, starting in the early 20th century or late 19th century, began to show up. And then we have the Paso y Troncoso versions, but we haven't had a complete until Acuña's transcription, which also has errors that are coming from other transcriptions. Uh-huh. So we're also dealing with this ongoing conversation of published materials. Mm-hmm. So there isn't anything comprehensive. We need to go back to those manuscripts. We need to have access to those manuscripts and then start to play with some of those transcriptions. But yeah, a lot of it's political, right? Yeah. Right? Yeah. Well, on the topic of political, it's also this question of Indigenous authorship and how do you identify that? And I just want to take a moment here because I'm so proud of this. and because we keep talking about the Florentine Codex, but in our exhibition, I think this is the first time this has ever happened. In our tombstone for the Florentine Codex, we don't just credit Sahagún as an author of the manuscript. And if you work in this subject, this is how it's always said. Sahagún and his indigenous collaborators, if they're even mentioned, and here's the Florentine Codex, and he's always cited as an author. And I just want to take a second to read all the names that we know, and we list them in a very long tombstone for our Florentine Codex. So we have Antonio Valeriano, Alonso Beguerrano, Martín Jacobita, Pedro de San Buenaventura, Diego de Grado, Bonifacio Maximiliano, Mateo Severino, and there are others. And what is remarkable is that these people haven't been mentioned, even though they're named right there in the manuscript. And it's really scholars who've worked with this manuscript, especially more recently, like our wonderful Diana Magaloni, who have been calling attention to these indigenous authors and the importance of their authorship and identifying them even if we don't have their names, which I think is so key. So with the RGs, are there any names?
Yeah, with the RGs, it's interesting because the first question is asking specifically for their names, and the last question is asking for their signatures. So you've got these names, not all of them. Some will say we consulted elders, but in some we have lineage. They're saying I'm son of this person, of that person, of that person. So it's very clear who is participating in this process. And also the fact that so many of the questions are geared specifically to indigenous people in a way that, anybody that lives in Mestitlan, anybody that lives in that community can tell you where the river is. That's one of the, where's the river? Anybody, I could do it. But I can't tell you about indigenous medicines that were used to cure. And so there are a lot of questions that would be really challenging for a Spaniard to answer. So you can tease out those voices, but I think ethnography, I think we have to reckon with the idea of authorship, especially in 20th century linguistics and anthropological studies, where we have the so-called informant or the collaborator, any kind of voice that's in our scholarship is indigenous knowledge production. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are some communities, for example, Milpa Alta, where there's a long stretch where they don't have somebody from Milpa Alta creating their own work. But they've got all kinds of linguistic studies where they ask for stories, where they ask for other kinds of information. And I think we continue to say, no, that's the author and that's data. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to think about, they're both authors, if we can use that term. They're both meaning makers. Mm-hmm. And it's intertwined and it's tricky, but to say otherwise, I think is exactly, and I said Sahagún and his collaborators, and I'm mortified. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We need to recognize that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And name them. I think
exactly.
is so key, because I think this is so great to have you together. And I mean, you've written about this as well. The indigenous intellectuals and scholars such as Ixtli Xochitl, but then we have voices from different types of level society in the RGs, and I think this is why you're absolutely right. It's such an exciting research and totally worth exploring more. And so there's sort of an unevenness even within the indigenous corpus about certain voices. Totally, of course, not that one shouldn't be studied more or the other, but it also makes me think of Felipe Guamapuma de Ayala, right? There's certain indigenous authors who we've gone back to because they have left such a great wealth of work. But it's so great that we have this these other sources as well. And so it's so great to have you both here representing those two different kind of voices. And also maybe both your works to shed more light on them, as well as discover other sort of these elite indigenous voices, so that we hear from the various perspectives. What I always find is how also the indigenous perspectives compete with each other, not just with the Spanish accounts. Yeah.
I think that's another thing that I'm really excited about in the RGs is there's a lot of pre-Hispanic history where they're talking about inter-indigenous conflict,
Yeah.
right? It has nothing to do with the bulk of some of the RGs is talking about everything but Spaniards.
Yeah.
But you're right of pointing out that it's elite men. So there are not women participating in the RGs.
Yeah.
There is some women's knowledge that is in them, but that's another issue that we have to grapple with. You know, we can look at Indigenous knowledge, but then we find ourselves stuck in these little boxes of who got to record something, and it tends to be a very small sector of society.
When these names crop up across different sources.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll just take a moment to commend you for the attribution to the named participants in the Florentine Codex project. Not just the collaborators, not just the Sagun et al. But I think that's really an important turning point in recognizing that and that question around authorship is key, because tied to that is a question of agency. When we start to perceive them as actual participants in the project, we can notice the ways in which those participants were interjecting their own agendas into that very project. And I think that allows us to take a slightly different perspective on looking at the text itself. So I commend you all for doing
and this is where, again, I look towards Diana Magaloni, who's done this work, and I'm, we've had so many conversations that it's like, we have to do this in our show. I also want to open it up now to questions from the audience. If anybody, I can't see too well here who is, but if the VSAs will come around and give you the mic, please wait for the microphone to come to you before you start speaking. So raise your hand and they will come to you.
So hello, my name is Jose Trinidad Castañeda, Kualitonali, and I wanted to start off with thank you for acknowledging the fact that we're on Tongva land. And it took a couple of speakers to get there, but we have eventually did acknowledge that. And then Kelly, so I wanted to ask you, what else are you doing to center Indigenous authors in your work? You did acknowledge it, but when you said Sahagun and Indigenous collaborators, I was ready to get up and leave. I was like, okay, like here we go. It's the same old, and I wanted to know what you're both doing to center more Indigenous authors. And also for Amber, when you presented the slide on, the killing of all natives, and you were just reifying the kind of stereotypes and stigmas that already exist out here, that like all the colonizers killed the natives and they're no longer here. And I think you have to preface that a little bit better, because, again, I'm just feeling like, wow, like, what was I expecting? Anything different? No. So I just wanted to comment on that, and that's all.
Great.
Well, I also should mention she's talking about an Indigenous author. So I think I completely take your point. And I thank you really for your comments, but I think the fact that her whole work focuses on an Indigenous author.
Oh, sure, and I'm happy to respond and happy to chat about it more later as well. And I appreciate the question and the tone of the question. Really, I think it's good to keep a contestatory approach when addressing this topic. But I would also say that I completely agree. Part of my point to pull that passage from Prescott was to say that in fact, he's actually undermining the very statement that he's making, because there were witnesses to that event who documented their stories, and those stories became documented in a series of texts that came to him eventually and have come down to us. And so by his saying that there was an annihilation of the participants is actually undermined by the very fact that there were witnesses who were able to relay the story. So I would say that I agree that we have to be attentive to some of the ways in which the narrative of the conquest has been represented as we revisit that narrative, and to be careful at each point in the ways in which we want to shed greater, broader light on those events. So I would imagine there's probably more that we would agree on than disagree on. And as I say, I'm happy to continue chatting later.
Good morning. My name is Roberto Orellana. I'm from Guatemala, and I'm an indigenous scholar at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute in Seattle, and other stuff. I appreciated your question, by the way, and then the presentations were excellent. And kind of threw me off, so I had another question, but I want to keep talking about that. I'm hoping that, and this is not just for the two presenters, but for the next 2 days when we're talking about this stuff. But I was thinking about the RGs and like, I knew this, but the fact that the 43 are in Austin, right, and the other ones are somewhere else, and in our responsibility, but. And then the title, right, Making Colonial Latin America. I mean, the fact that they're still there, that means that we're continuing to make Latin America colonial by taking the knowledge and keeping it to ourselves, and then saying it's never going back, or we're gonna make it digital and give it back, but we're keeping your knowledge. So are we? I mean, you all know what I'm trying to say. We're still colonizing these lands, and we're studying the knowledge, and with what purpose?
Can I respond to that? Hi, thank you so much. With the RGs and the institutional relationships, I think that one of the things that I try to do is go beyond the institutions and connect with indigenous people in Mexico that are interested in having access to their own cultural patrimony. And I think that there are institutions that are working together that will, institutionally in terms of, we're going to transfer this to a Mexican archive. I don't see that being something that will be happening really soon, and it is colonial. You're absolutely right. So what do we do when we work in this particular situation and we're in the middle of the sticky, muddy, icky stuff? We start asking people, like, what do I do? And that's one of the things that I did with the folks that I've been working with, the NAWA folks, is that I've asked, like, what should I do? What do you want? And I think that is where we can start, is having that conversation and asking those questions. We don't have to wait for the institution to figure it out.
And probably if you did that on an institutional level, it would go to Mexico City and not to the indigenous community. Of course. And then it would go, into the central repositories, which are wonderful. But then you have possibly, more restricted access depending on what institutions we're talking about.
Right.
So.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Barbara Fuchs at UCLA. This was more of a question about the textual traditions, and I'm wondering, trying to put your two super interesting papers together, if anyone has looked at whether the Relaciones Geográficas themselves become a model or provide an opportunity for other kinds of indigenous texts. And I actually was thinking about Wamampoma, right? There's something about the structure that I found in this context, right? Somewhat reminiscent of the kind of project. And so I don't just mean in a prescriptive sense, now we're going to go off and do our own RGs, but how does it present a kind of opportunity for laying out knowledge, or beginning with the knowledge to make a particular kind of case, as POMA does?
Yeah, I'm not sure about Wamampoma. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think probably something that we could say would be happening, and we would need to look at this more carefully, but just as a question to begin with is, do projects like the Relaciones Geográficas Questionnaire set out kind of a discourse around defining what elements of the culture are important and we should be attentive to, that then impacts on even those indigenous authors who are writing about their own places and peoples? I would imagine that it's something more like that going on with Wamampoma than necessarily a more direct response to a specific questionnaire. But I think that's worth asking. Who sort of sets the discussion of which cultural features should be most central to any kind of narrative that's constructed. I think that's certainly, and the Relaciones Geográficas probably are very important to that process.
I cannot speak to Wamampoma at all. But I do want to mention how you're talking about how the questionnaires are showing us what's important in that particular time frame, and it's shaping this idea of what the culture should be. But I want to point to the RGs that are circulating in Spain at the same time. And there are, I think it's 1578 and 1582 versions of Spanish Iberian Peninsula RGs that circulate, and you can see a very dramatic change. Well, I guess I see a very dramatic change in the way that subjects are, in 2 years, changing how subjects are thought of and how they should be in the colonial world. One of the things in the first questionnaire is that they ask a lot about who's the lord of the area, who has power, who's in charge here, what are the great things that they've done, and all of those things are stripped from the next survey. So there's this cognizance of we're creating I am the center, right? You see that centrality of the king, and you see that change of, we don't want lots of other people in power. We're the ones that are. We don't want to record these stories of you being the lord of this space for hundreds of years, or your family. So we can see that in the Spanish surveys. I haven't had a chance to look really in the multiple iterations of the RG questionnaires for Latin America, but I think that that's something that we will definitely see shifts in the way that the subjects that they are addressing are being spoken to and the questions they're asking.
Here.
What's
Hi.
time?
I know we're over, but we also started late, and then the difficulty. Yeah.
Can I continue?
Yes.
We have time. Diana Magaloni, thank you very much for both your talks, and thank you, Kim, so much for mentioning that my work contributed to this. I really just want to say something that both your talks make me continually think. Both are colonial projects. I mean, Xochitl is a historian, and it's a historian that he's aware of his indigenous nobility and heritage and ancestral lineage within New Spain. It is not the Aztec Empire that he's claiming to be part of. So that is why he needs to make Cortés also of royal lineage, because Cortés is at the beginning of his time. New Spain is a new space and time for Mesoamerica, and all the indigenous nobility have this awareness, and they create a dialogue with those who are in power. And we have not seen this point of view. We have either want to preserve the pristine knowledge of the past indigenous past that we don't have access to, and it's through these people, through these, I will call them mestizos with pride, really. I know it is in the 30s that Gamio and Rivera created the idea of the mestizo, which is an amazing idea, but it's in reality the product of indigenous knowledge and of indigenous point of view, where when you read the sources, when you see how these indigenous intellectuals, by 1528, they were reading Latin, Spanish, they even knew some Greek, and they were translating all these texts of the Western knowledge into Nahuatl because they were creating a new, space and time for New Spain that also contained Europe. And so unless we acknowledge that the point of view from these intellectuals was that of understanding the West, of becoming part of the West, but from the indigenous perspective, we won't understand these colonial projects, and we won't understand, or we won't give the level of intellectual pride and proneness that these indigenous people had in this time. And you see that also in the colonial relaciones geográficas. But it is so interesting that we need to see how these colonial projects that have the means, the paper, like Sahagún, it's only the Spaniards that have the means to create these things, or the Nahua elite. How within that, the indigenous communities participated with the knowledge that they needed to be, in a sense, use the Spanish knowledge and the Spanish resources to express themselves. So it is not only knowledge and how it is done, but I think we should be looking for the point of view. What are the fundamental categories of thought of the indigenous people within the colonial context, and how this dialogue really creates a new knowledge, a new time. I don't know if I'm expressing what I want to express, but I think we should be always aware of that intent, from where it is coming from. And I heard in both of your talks that, but it would be so good for us as a group to become more conscious about it, to state it more overtly, in a sense, to open the doors for indigenous knowledge really to be part of us. And also in the present, like indigenous Nahua people who could be, saying how they see these, how they think about it, to really be more open to that. Sorry for taking so long.
And we can be very quick in whatever response we give, and we can certainly continue that. I think that's a very fundamental point that that needs to be made, and that also I might follow up by saying as well, maybe in starker terms, that I think we should avoid any kind of dichotomy between indigenous knowledge and European knowledge. Alba Isisotl is, and I say this with absolute adoration, he is a colonial figure, and his work is the product of that society. To turn to him with the attempt of trying to access, as you say, a pristine pre-Columbian past is not productive, and so there, I think there is that growing general awareness, and that by acknowledging that these are products of a colonial society, we don't have to then say, oh, well, then they cease to be indigenous. I think that's sort of maybe where a crux of the conversation could be pushed a little bit more. But I would encourage us to avoid any kind of simple one or the other. Mm-hmm.
I think that we do see more in literary cultural studies. I think that we are behind in acknowledging that indigenous people can have European knowledge and their knowledge and be in this really unique, messy situation and still be creating knowledge and still be indigenous. So, but in our particular discipline, we still are very, or let me just say it this way, there is still a search for the pristine. And I think what both Amber and I are doing is saying, why? Why? Because that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at exactly what you're talking about, a very specific context that's creating very specific kinds of knowledge. And that doesn't mean that it's not indigenous. Yeah.
And what would pristine even mean, even if
Exactly.
we had pre-Columbian,
Exactly.
Texts available, which in some cases we do have. What does that even mean, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, we can discuss more over outside during the brief break. We'll do like 10 minutes or so, quick bathroom break. Thank you so much to our speakers, and we'll see you back here shortly.